Hello, hello. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today we are joined by a very, very special guest, Dylan of Existential Delight. How you doing today, brother?
Good, thanks, man. How are you?
I'm I'm doing great. So I'm pretty excited about today's stream. We've actually been going back and forth in the DMs where everything goes down, and and we were thinking about doing a video together and looking for a topic. And I thought, well, why don't we just read many of the great quotes and wisdom that one of your favorite guys, G.K. Chesterton, has to offer. So that's kind of what we're going to be getting into today. And by the way, I really enjoyed your recent video on Lord Voldemort. Nice work there. I like the way that you edited that video.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, that was a fun one.
You want to tell everybody kind of what that video was about?
Oh, yeah, sure. Say what you want about Harry Potter. The character of Voldemort, they really get the way that they represent evil through him is really well done. And basically, the crux of the video is that in the first Harry Potter film, Voldemort tells Harry this line at the end of the film, which is, "That's it, Harry. There is no good or evil. There is only power, and those too weak to seek it." And I basically make the argument that if you want to undermine the good, you shouldn't define yourself in opposition to the good. If you want to undermine the good, you have to deny that there is such a thing as an objective standard of good and evil, which is what true evil does. So the video is just me exploring that idea.
Oh, that's great. And if you're available for maybe just 20 minutes after the stream, I'd love to potentially talk to you about that video, about some of my own takes, but potentially for members only. Yeah, that's if you're available. But
Yeah, I'm in.
all right, excellent. Because we did a private chat. You're actually my first members only content. We did a video last time we were together. We talked afterwards, and I've got a lot of positive feedback from that. A lot of people enjoyed that conversation. So I guess shamelessly, I'll go ahead and say, if you guys are interested, please go to davidpatrickcarey.com/register and become a website member. You get access to 2 entire video libraries, one of education and one of fitness. So if that's something you'd be interested, or you just want to help out, I recommend doing that. So you'll be able to see the private conversation Dylan and I will have later. But without further ado, I think we should just dive into today's meaty topic of G.K. Chesterton. So where do you want to start? Do you want to go into, I know you have some quotes that you've picked, and so many of these things we can just dive deeply into. It may take hours. So maybe we can begin by highlighting some that you are interested in. We can go over and kind of deconstruct those. I have some that I chose, but then also, guys, we have a whole category. So today's show may be a little bit more interactive, if you will. That there's a whole list of categories of quotes by G.K. Chesterton that if we can talk about, we could read and then reflect on and get feedback from you guys if you're interested. And so those categories, outside the ones that he chose and I have chose, include timeless truths, wisdoms, again, from G.K. Chesterton. So these are just categories of quotes. Free advice, the cult of progress, war and politics, government and politics, sex or society and culture, love, marriage and the sexes, religion and faith, Christmas, morality and truth, economic theory and distributism, art and literature, past words on today's dilemmas, Islam, atheism, courage, friendship, liberty, the skeptic, and today's world. If any of those sound particularly interesting and you want to hear more quotes in those topics, feel free to comment in the comment section, the live chat, or send in a super chat. But I think to get started, let's just hear what some of the quotes that you've put together, and what go ahead and take us away. How do you want to begin today's conversation?
Okay, thanks, man. Well, I guess one of the core themes, even the title of this video, I believe, is sort of the paradoxical wisdom, right? Because Chesterton's often known as the Prince of Paradox. And in many ways, he shows how Christianity is sort of at heart a paradox. Just the idea that we get life from death, the idea that through self-denial, we truly find ourselves and our place in the universe. And so there's a quote, it's actually a big paragraph, but there's just every single line is just quotable. So what I thought I would do is just really playing on this idea of paradoxes.
Hmm.
I'll sort of just begin with a few lines, maybe just read them, and then we can reflect. So it's at the end, close to the end of the book Orthodoxy by Chesterton, which is a must read for everyone. I think it's a fantastic book. And Chesterton says, quote, Christianity is the only religion on earth that has felt that omnipotence made God incomplete. Christianity alone felt that God, in order to be holy God, must have been a rebel as well as a king. Alone of all creeds, Christianity has added courage to the virtues of the Creator. For the only courage worth calling courage must necessarily mean that the soul passes a breaking point and does not break. So that line,
Wow.
oh, there's so many great ones there, but Christianity alone has felt that God, in order to be whole, God needed to be a rebel and a king. He needed to flip the tables and be royalty, which is such an interesting idea, actually, because you don't see it anywhere else. Do you want to say anything on that point?
No, I love that. And so when you're talking about, um, both, it gives courage to God. I think about, again, these paradoxical understandings, how, Christ, the sort of self-limiting. I recently was speaking about self-control, and I think this is a really interesting concept. Is that within, I was reading an Orthodox article, and it was talking about the virtue of self-control, and how this is a virtue of God in which we can also participate in. And I started to think about the omnipotence of God. And so we often don't think of the limiting, self-limiting force, the self-control of God, because we tend to only think of the omnipotence. And so again, we see this paradox, and we see again personhood. To be a person is to be sort of self-limited. And so we see God being omnipotent. We see God being three persons then, and it's sort of three representations to look back at each other, to have true love, all this different stuff. We can get deeper into the theology of the Trinity, but it's just the same thing about God entering into creation in the incarnation. This is another paradox, right? That God is both creator and he's also created, in the sense that he collapses that dialectic. He enters into creation. See, he permeated creation. He created creation, but he wasn't inside of it until the incarnation. And so through the incarnation, then God is now inside creation as you and I are. So it's just another, again, the profound. I want to read the whole. Chesterton has a whole section here called "The Paradoxes of Christianity" in this book. I may do that as another private video for members, and just reading that section. But it's great, and I love this thing because it's a different type of thinking, and I think it appeals to you formerly in the psychedelics, as of myself. And so the sort of paradoxical, the sort of conundrum type form of thinking, it feels good. It has meat. There's substance to it. There's something exhilarating about these sort of using logic to pierce through what would be perceived as paradoxes or opposites or anything like that. So I don't know. I love that. I love that quote. And if you have more or wanted to read more, feel free, because I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah, but just on what you said, it's almost like these paradoxical understandings, they scratch an itch that nothing else can scratch.
Right.
It just satisfies you in a way that's very hard to get things. And it's funny that you mentioned the paradoxes of Christianity, because a bunch of the quotes I have is right here from that chapter on paradoxes of Christianity. So I'll turn to that in a second, but I just had this thought. It's like even just God becoming man is in some sense this bizarre paradox, right? This idea that there's this incarnation, and it's like try and imagine two natures more different from each other than God and man. Like we're so different, and yet in the incarnation you have a union, fully God, fully man. And it's almost like you see this symbolically in marriage, where you have the unifying of two opposite natures, male and female, coming together. And it's almost like a symbolic representation of the union of two opposite natures of God and man in the incarnation, right?
Right.
And when the two come together, you have the third, of course. And that also sort of also symbolically, in a way, represents the Trinity. And I think, just going back to this quote, the one we were just reading, so we add courage to the virtues of the Creator, because you wouldn't think God would need courage, right?
Right.
And yet, when Christ is in the Garden of Gethsemane, it's like, to do this, knowing what's coming, there is a level of courageousness there. And God finds courage, and that gives us the strength to find it ourselves. And then Chesterton says, he basically then just apologizes because he's about to touch on a matter which the greatest saints and thinkers have justly feared to approach. And then he says, but in the terrific tale of the Passion, there is a distinct emotional suggestion that the author of all things, in some unthinkable way, went not only through agony, but through doubt. That God himself, the author of all things, in some strange way, the tale of the Passion suggests that he went through agony and, interestingly, doubt. It is written, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. No, but the Lord thy God may tempt himself. And it seems as if this was what happened in Gethsemane. In a God and Satan tempted man, and in a God and God tempted God. He surpassed the superhuman manner through our human horror of pessimism. When the world shook and the sun was wiped out of heaven, it was not at the crucifixion, but at the cry from the cross. The cry which confessed that God was forsaken of God. My God, why have you forsaken me? And then just to end this off, he says, yes. And now let the revolutionists choose a creed from all the creeds and a God from all the gods of the world. And they will not find another God who has himself been in revolt. Nay, the matter grows too difficult for human speech. But let the atheists themselves choose a God. They will find only one divinity who ever uttered their isolation. Only one religion in which God seemed for an instant to be an atheist. Oh my goodness.
Gosh, I love that.
itch.
I love that.
That's genius. It's
Go ahead with your initial takeaways. I mean, what?
Oh, well, okay, so just that line, right? Let the atheist choose a God. There's only one divinity who ever uttered their isolation. It's like in the moment where God feels cut off from God, where he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Christ is the only figure that can relate to the atheist who feels that way. God, why, God is not real and I hate him. It's like, why are you not there? And Christ actually covers all aspects of human experience, and in some weird way, even atheism, which is, just a testament to the truth. Yeah, that would be my initial takeaway. Sorry, I read so much there, but that other line as well, right. In a God and Satan tempted man, and also in a God and God tempted God. And this is why Chesterton apologizes, right? Because he's like, I don't want to sound irreverent. I'm approaching something that people have feared to approach. And he's not saying this in a way to sort of suggest, God, we should be atheists. But it's just such a beautiful expression of how Christ covers every aspect of human experience.
Right. Oh, that's so well put. And that's so well put. And what I loved about, because it continued with what you were talking about in regards to courage. And courage, again, tying back to a previous stream, the definition of courage from a Christian standpoint isn't that you don't feel fear. It's that you feel fear, but you're not afraid. And so there's a separation between the experience of fear and the state of being afraid. And so, so we see Christ experience fear, but he doesn't retreat. He doesn't give up. He doesn't become afraid. He moves forward, right? And so again, we see in the garden there, it's like this beautiful expression of it gets into the whole concepts of God's will and how knowledgeable was Christ, was the logos of infinity as the person of Jesus Christ, right? Because the Logos knows the beginning and the end of history. But when he voluntarily enters creation, he also voluntarily takes on the limitations of human nature. Again, that those necessary limitations within creation to have experience, right? So
Yeah, well said.
things have to be limited and things have to be dualistic for there to be a gradient for experience to occur in the first place. And so God, being omnipotent, voluntarily limits himself in the human person. And then in the garden, what we see is that Christ was God, but Christ was also man, and there is the human nature of this separation, right? Of this experience of fear. Yet at the same time, he doesn't break with God's will. He continues through God's will. Again, then highlighting again why he's the perfect icon for us to do the exact same thing. That even the Son of God, even God himself as man, cried out to God in in fear and worry, but he didn't
Yeah.
stop there.
Yeah. So the moment everything seems like it's shattered in your life and you're crying to God, why have you forsaken me? Suddenly at that moment, Jesus is right there with you. So it's that same experience is there. And you mentioned courage, and courage is itself a paradox.
Right.
And this is another really famous Chesterton quote. It's in this chapter, The Paradoxes of Christianity. And the quote is, "Courage is almost a contradiction in terms. It means a strong desire to live, taking the form of a readiness to die. A strong desire to live, taking the form of a readiness to die. He that will lose his life, the same shall save it." It is not a piece of mysticism for saints and heroes. It is a piece of everyday advice for sailors or mountaineers. It might be printed in an alpine guide or a drill book. The paradox is the whole principle of courage, even of quite earthly or quite brutal courage. A man cut off by the sea may save his life if he will risk it on the precipice. He can only get away from death by continually stepping within an inch of it. Yeah. So even courage, again, feeding into the paradoxes of Christianity, right? The very notion of having courage, of being willing to enter danger. You feel the most alive when your life is the closest to being taken away from you,
Yes.
which is,
Oh no, I love that. In that the way that he phrased it, that you escape death by always staying so near to it.
yes.
In that's like, again, sort of living on that live edge and that complacency. If you live a life that's not, there's so much meaning present with one's own experience when life that is lived is literally on the precipice of life and death. And so
Yeah.
when we look at then the nihilistic glaze over contemporary society, how many people's lives are ever at that live edge of their life? However, and so what activities are men engaging in the contemporary moment that actually puts them at that live edge? And that's why then you look at the video game culture, you look at fantasy fulfilling the absence of men actually doing those things in real life. So now
Yeah.
the vast adventures, they're done through VR or they're done through your Xbox or your PlayStation or something like that. It's not you who are actually doing it, and therefore it's like this devoidness again of the personhood, because it's you as the person that's made in the image, and so it's you as the person that also has to go on these journeys.
Yeah, it's like your own life. There is no journey in your own life, so you have to try and grasp at it virtually. You have to try and create some kind of an exhilaration, because ordinary life has become so mundane. Um, and that can be, I think, immensely addictive. I mean, because it is thrilling to get even a virtual sense compared to how mundane ordinary life is. And you kind of have to completely step outside of your comfort zone in your day-to-day life. And the irony is that you'll actually find that meaning in that journey once you do that. But that is where courage comes in. It's that willingness to risk something. Um, it's such a cliche. I can't even believe I'm thinking of it, but no risk, no reward. You're not going to achieve anything great if you sit back and just wait for things to happen, or try and relive great moments virtually, or wait for somebody to write that book for you, or wait for somebody to share that thought that you know is controversial, or people might take it wrongly, but you know that it's true. And you know that by saying it, you're actually going to be helping somebody out there. So it takes courage. And courage is actually a requirement we need as followers of Christ. It's if we're going to embody Christ, we need to have courage.
Absolutely. And if we're taking, again, the theology seriously, courage is to feel fear but not be afraid. It's to face, again, if we're in a fallen world that is ruled by our enemy, courage is the necessity to even live the Christian life, because to do that is going to be, by definition, to be in opposition to this world. And so you're not even going to be able to go down that path. And so then we look at the subverted and the cucked forms of Christianity in the world. It's a lack of courage. But in the name of courage, and this is what I was trying to get at in my previous stream on the inversions of Christian virtues, in the lack of courage, they deem themselves to be courageous because they're promoting Black Lives Matter, because they're promoting the pride parades, because they're promoting these things. They see themselves in this notion of progress as the sort of the live edge of their own courage, where really, again, it's promoted by the Fortune 500 companies, it's promoted by globalist organizations. All the people actually trying to manipulate them want them to have those opinions. And so is that really courage? No, it can't be courage by definition, because you're not standing up to anything. What exactly are you standing up to? And so they don't have real courage.
And if the church just goes with the age, there's a line, I don't think it's Chesterton, but if the church basically just goes with the age, it actually relinquishes its courage. It actually gives up what it needs to have. And if a church becomes a bride of the current age, it'll become a widow in the next. So we have to be, this is a Chesterton quote, we don't want a church that moves with the world. We want a church that moves the world, right? We want something that stands obstinately and says, no, this is the way things should be. And the church, by its very existence, is in a sense courage. It's a refusal to submit to the fallen world.
Right. Absolutely. And I have another quote here, because I did have... You've taken about 4 of my quotes out of orthodoxy. It's fine. No, that's fine, because it was better read in context than just as one-liners, the way that I had them anyway. So another quote that I wanted to share on courage is one that he had from What's Wrong with the World, and it reads, "There's not really any courage at all in attacking orrery or antiquated things, any more than in offering to fight one's grandmother. The really courageous man is he who defies tyrannies young as the morning and superstitions fresh as the fresh flowers. The only true freethinker is he whose intellect is as much free from the future as from the past." And so I loved that, because it really talks about the contemporary scene globally, but certainly you could take an American context for that, in that courage, isn't the attacking of Christendom or Western civilization, or all these, again, looking back in history and continually revising, criticizing. This is the nature of really the academic enterprise right now. That's not really courageous. What would be courageous, as he says, is to actually fight the tyrannies that are young, youthful, and full of energy in the present moment, that are existing right here. Why talk about the tyrannies of Rome? How is that courageous?
Yeah.
Like,
and
why
it's
don't...
like, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Don't mean to interrupt.
I was just going to say...
Oh, no, I was just...
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, people criticize Christianity for being too meek, and that it turns you into a weak person, and then in the same breath they criticize Christianity for being too violent. They criticize Christianity because they say that it takes women out of the home and puts them in cloisters, makes them cloistered nuns, takes them away from the family, and then they criticize Christianity for instituting the very notion of family. So Chesterton says, if you have one group of people that are saying this man is too tall, and you have one group of people that are saying this man is too short, and one group of people that are saying this man is too good, and one people saying this man is too bad, it's probably that the man himself is actually fine, and he's the only sane one.
Right.
All the critics are mad, right? And it's Christianity. It's criticized from every angle. Even the criticisms of Christianity are contradictory. You criticize it for the good it does and the bad it does, but they can't find the within the center of all the criticisms is something which if you get down to it, you realize that is actually the one sane thing, and all the criticisms are insane. So Christianity sort of inverts all those things. Mm-hmm. Sorry, did you want to finish your other point?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm pretty much done on that point.
Okay.
I was next. I'll probably just read another quote if that's cool with you.
Yeah. So I had quotes actually related to exactly what you're talking about, but I have a whole list of them.
Yeah, go for it.
So, talking about that, let me see. Alone of all creeds, Christianity has added. Oh no, that was the one that you read. It was before that. There are those who hate Christianity and call their hatred an all-embracing love for all religions. And so that was what I was looking for. And so that highlights, again, the reason why I think Christianity and Christian values and virtues are so inverted by the world is because fundamentally they're true. And so the way in which you manipulate somebody is that you have to have seeds of truth. And so when we look at like virtue signaling and social justice stuff, much of this is rooted within a sort of Christian ethic or ethos. That's why then they want to appeal to Christ as their socialist and all this different stuff. Of course, they don't read scripture. They have no idea of theology. They're totally divorced from any actual understanding of it. But I think this is why Christianity, again, is so singled out, and why it's so striking when I try to make a stream about, okay, this is how we define something, and then let's look at what would be the opposite of that, and we tend to just begin to map out the whole progressive ideology. Is that what it does is it gets the people to feel the virtue and the fullness as if they were actually adopting these Christian ethical principles and virtues, with actually doing the exact opposite of what they would entail. And so the idea that everybody, that there are those who hate Christianity and call their hatred an all-embracing love of all religions, I think is exactly that. Is that they hate this one thing because really it's the one true thing. And so it's so much easier than to embrace all these non-true things in their opposition. And that's what we're seeing more and more and more happening in the world, is this singling out of Christianity because it's not playing well, right? It's not going along with the agenda. So anything, you can go to the next quote or anything like that. I just wanted to find that quote because it's related to what you were saying.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it actually reminds me of since this is the theme of the stream, another great Chesterton line is that the modern world, it's not that it doesn't have a heart, it's that its heart is in the wrong place. So you hear this expression, right? He's got his heart in the right place. The modern world's heart is almost too big. So Chesterton says the modern world is full of the old Christian values gone mad. And the reason they've gone mad is we've isolated and separated them from each other. So you have love, but you also have truth, but love and truth are separated. So you'll have somebody that's trying to be extremely loving, but there's no truth behind their love. So they'll just permit anything because they just want to love the person. I don't want to make you feel bad, but at the sacrifice of truth, they've isolated love from truth. So you have people who have pity, but their pity is truthless. And then you have people with truth, but their truth is pitiless, right? These are Chesterton lines. And then the biggest one would probably be the dislocation of humility, where the sort of historical view was, okay, there's the world around me that God has created. How can I align myself to the world? How can I align myself to creation? And I don't mean fallen creation. I just mean, how can I align myself in the way that God has set up the world? Clearly, sin is a reality. I need to align myself in such a way that I avoid it. So it's almost been inverted now, where it's okay, we need to change the world to suit us. I need to change the world to suit my desires, however selfish or terrible they might be. So I love that idea that it's not that the Christian values have gone away, which I think is adding to what you just said. It's that they've been almost dissected and separated from each other. They're no longer a unifying whole, which is what a Christian should try to embody, right? He's trying to hold all the values in one. So I'm showing love to you. But at the same time, if you are if I can see that you're addicted to alcohol and I can see it's destroying your life, the loving thing to do would be to be honest with you. But you see, the moment I say that, I'm being honest with you, I'm incorporating another value. I'm no longer separating the value. I'm now bringing truth into it. Right. And that's ultimately going to be a more full expression of both love and truth. But now you have people that'll just basically commit anything because love is the core value. And even if it violates truth. And so the values are not gone. We've just dissected them. We've cut them off from one another, and they're no longer a unified whole.
Oh, that is so brilliant. That's exactly what they've done, and because they're so disconnected, that's why they can be so easily inverted. There is because if things are tied to then a structure, it's way more difficult to invert that entire structure than it is to invert just key components and redefinition. And that's why I try to highlight to everybody is that definitions and meanings of words really matter, because that is the playing field. That is the battleground, if you will, because what you believe words to mean colors your entire ability to think. What you're able to perceive, what you're able to see, what you're able to know is totally tied to that. So, I thought that was absolutely brilliant. And I had a quote related to moderns and courage from Chesterton. Another one I wanted to read is that moderns have not the moral courage as a rule to avow the sincere spiritual bias behind their fads. They become insincere even by their sincerity. Most modern liberality consists of finding irreligious excuses for religious bigotry. The earlier type of bigot pretended to be more religious than he really was. The latter type pretends to be less religious than he really is. He does not wear a mask of piety, but rather a mask of impiety, or at any rate of indifference. And I thought that was so profound because, again, it gives so much color to looking at the contemporary person and the progressive movement, the BLM, the Antifa, just these radical socialists, the comrades, the communists, that what that all stems from is the religious yearning that they claim they don't have. And so the same religious bigot of the old times that was more religious or perceived to be, the pharisaical display of one's piety being more than it really is, that is virtue signaling. That is the modern progressive. They are that person, again, inverted, twisted. The paradox, the irony is that they themselves perceive themselves as non-religious. You, being the Christian, you're the backwards person. You're the ignorant one. You're the one that's antiquated. I'm not. And at the same time, once you look into it, they are the bigot. They are the one that is overly religious. They are the one practicing a form of public pietism to show their social value.
Yes, it's almost like they're let me just think about how I'm going to phrase this. Okay, so I'm reminded of another Chesterton quote, which is just that there are two types of people. There are people who believe in dogmas and know it, and there are people who believe in dogmas and don't know it, or don't acknowledge it, or don't accept it, right? So they have dogma. They have very almost doctrinal things you cannot say, things you cannot do. This is wrong. You can't use this word. You can't use that type of speech. And they adhere to it like dogma. And, if somebody violates it, you're a heretic. Yep. And the only difference is the Christian admits, yes, do have dogmas, and I'm happy to say why I believe I should follow them. Um, the difference is you want everything. You actually have the mythological, metaphysical substructure of religion. You just don't describe it in the same language. The myth you're operating under is sort of a mix of scientism plus naturalism plus sort of this strange egotistic materialism. But these are just terms for a myth, the myth of the modern world, right? My myth, and we could go into a whole discussion on the word myth, right? Because I don't mean myth to
me it's false. You're not saying it's false. You're saying that
yes,
whether there can be a myth or mythic legend about something that factually happened. It's just that you're talking about this sort of narrative aspect of it.
Yeah. Like Christianity is the true myth. It's
right.
It actually happened, right? So they want all of the it's almost like they're stealing all of these requirements. I think sometimes you even see this in the justification of morality, and we don't have to get into the moral argument right now, but it's almost like, yes, this is wrong. Okay, why is it wrong? How are you justifying it's wrong? Well, it's just not beneficial to humankind. Why is it not beneficial to humankind? Because I find it wrong. I have an intuition it's wrong. But where do you get this sense of right and wrong? Oh no, I just have it, right? It's like a denial that there's something transcendent informing your inferences as to what is right and wrong. And the same thing seems to be happening with dogmas and beliefs. Like people have these beliefs that they hold very, very firmly. And it's almost like they will not admit that in some ways they're just as religious.
Right.
Because I think ultimately you can't remove the religious nature of man. You can't remove that. You can't take it away. You will just fill it with something else. But in the modern world, we fill it with something and we call it this sort of secular atheistic naturalism. But it's a false myth.
Mm-hmm.
It's a myth that doesn't adequately explain things. And it's a myth that puts reason, the ego, the self as God. And so you find people that create their own rituals. I'm going to create my own rituals. I'm going to worship myself. My happiness is paramount. My satisfaction in life is ideal. And so too is your happiness. But if your happiness infringes upon his happiness, then we've got to do something about you, right? So there's this weird contradiction at the heart of it. And ultimately, it seems like a world in which the soul is still yearning for God, but that same world denies that there is a soul. So it's filled up with cheap substitutes. Because heaven was always man's first love, and earth was always only just a substitute. But now earth has become man's first love, and heaven has become this throwaway that only archaic people seem to believe in. Right. From that point of view.
Yeah, heaven almost becomes the ideal for the earth, right? As opposed, the earth's ideal is to be like heaven. They're trying to do the exact opposite. Again, we see another direct inversion.
Yes.
And so continuing on with that sort of religious yearning within the progressive, or the people who actually express their lack of religion, their lack of faith, that they actually do end up having dogma. And you can look at, when this is something I've tried to highlight in previous streams, is when we start to look at people's belief structures, is what do they ultimately appeal to? And so I don't care if they claim to be a Christian, if they're wearing a surgical mask and they have a face shield on and they're in church, clearly their worldview is not appealing to a Christian paradigm. So even though whatever what they claim, because Christ or God, it's just going to be a compartmentalized box within their mind. The people ultimately, and that's why I think this mass stuff is so indicative, because it highlights what do people ultimately appeal to? What do they ultimately believe? What do they really have faith in? And more than God, they have faith in a surgical mask to stop a virus. It makes no sense. It's totally irrational. It does, like, why would you have faith in a cloth? Why would you have faith in this thing? Why do you have faith in Dr. Fauci? Why do you have faith in all these things? But at the same time, you claim to be a Christian, you claim to profess a belief in God, and you show no faith in that regard. And so the idea of not having a dogma is a dogma. And again, it's just a very logical flip, but the idea of people being tied to dogmas or being dogmatic as being lesser in one's ability to perceive reality or invalidates your opinion in one way or another, you by definition are being dogmatic in your refusal or your refusal to recognize dogmas as potentially being legitimate. Plus, it's a logical fallacy because it's a genetic fallacy. Just because something is a dogma doesn't mean it's wrong. So you have to prove why the dogma is wrong. That's a whole nother thing. And so there's just the dogmatic belief against dogma is ridiculous. It itself, it violates logic in two ways. One, both is dogmatic, and two, it's a logical fallacy.
Yeah, it's like we always have faith in something. Faith never really goes away. You just alter the object of your faith, right? So, and it's funny because the same people who might typically say, and I don't want to put everybody into the same box, but you'll often find people who say, faith is kind of like a delusion. It takes faith to assume that your thoughts have any relation to reality at all.
Right.
That is already an assumption. That already takes some level of faith, right? So it's not so much a question of whether we can rely on faith itself. It's what do you put faith in? That's really the key question that a person has to wrestle with.
Right. Well, you want to here? I have some more quotes. Let me read a few. We can reflect, or I can just go through them. These are some that I've picked. Again, guys, if you guys want me to read some of those other topics, again, most of you guys probably weren't here when I was reading that, but so here's one from Orthodoxy actually that I liked. Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the arrogant oligarchy who merely happen to be walking around. And so I love that. Again, I'd love to get your take on that. My initial response is that's exactly it. Is the foolishness of the modern wise person, right? That they're against tradition, that they're against religion. All these things are antiquated systems to control people, or whatever slow boy, low IQ take that they're going to provide. But tradition, when you really think about it, is the accumulation of wisdom over time. The idea that somehow you are smarter than tradition in one regard, although again we can talk about nuances a little bit more critically, but that itself is extremely egotistical and extremely foolish, because look at then much of the ideas that the modern person who refuses tradition promotes, and they're all ideas that have already been played out in history, and they all undercut themselves. And so the fool then is doing things, right, that ultimately leads nowhere. It's to do the same thing over and over and over and expect a different result. Is that not what we see? By the rejecting of tradition, we see the rise of the fool as an authoritative figure in our society.
Yeah, a thought that's carried me through a lot of situations is 9 out of 10 new ideas are just old mistakes. 9 out of 10 new ideas are just old mistakes that are so old that we've forgotten that they're mistakes. And that quote you mentioned, a tradition is the democracy of the dead. We, everybody who's currently alive, we are the arrogant oligarchy of those who just happen to be walking around.
Right.
And what are we walking around in? Well, decisions, democracy, right, of the dead, the decisions that they made to formulate and to shape the world we're currently inhabiting, were invested in that world, and they've put up all these walls around us. And this leads to another Chesterton quote, which is that don't tear a wall down until you know why it was put up in the first place. Right. So it's like we have this democracy of the dead that's implanted everything. And if you think about it, this is another way of saying our ancestors, right? Those who came before us. And it kind of touches on a topic we spoke about a little while back. The sort of traditional view is, would my ancestors be ashamed of me? Whereas the modern position is, should I be ashamed of my ancestors?
Right.
So again, you mentioned inversion, right? So we have all of these walls put up for us by our ancestors, by the dead by the democracy, and we're living in them. And our first reaction should probably not be, okay, well, how many can we tear down? Because I know better than everything that came before me because we have all the current advancements of technology. But to me, there's a fundamental problem with this. It's such, I don't know any other word. It's just so arrogant to think that I know better. I mean, I'm not, if somebody asks me, how should we fix the world? I don't know. I don't understand the complex geopolitical, I mean, there's so many things that are so out of my purview, so out of my scope. And then to suggest that, I might know how to help myself and my family and my community and, my area, and help others to do the same thing. But the assumption that the whole world, the traditions that have been here for so long, that have come before us, that we're just going to tear that down, seems to me not only dangerous, but on some level extremely arrogant, right? And another great Chesterton line is that the walls that have been put up for us, we can see them as walls of a prison, or we can see them as walls of a playground. And often there are walls of a playground, and once you understand and you accept your limitations, you can then work within the limitations. It's like a chess game, right? There's certain things I can do in a chess game. There's certain moves I can make. I can't break certain rules, but the rules allow us, the boundaries allow us to play the game. Whereas it's a good question to be asked was, can we improve the rules so that we can have a better game? That's a good question to ask, right? But the right approach is not, okay, well, let's actually just remove all the rules. You can move your pawn all the way to my king and just take it in one move. It's going to ruin the game.
Right. Absolutely. And when you were talking about the quote in regards to knowing why the walls were put up, I think that, again, that'd be assuming Chesterton's talking to an honest person, because ultimately I think what would inform, theologically speaking, why the walls are coming down is it's the permission of sin, ultimately. And so this is the game the devil has always tried to play. This is always the game. And so the only reason why somebody would want to know why the walls were put up and keep them up is for an honest person wanting what is best. It may be not knowing what is best, or confused by the programming, all the stuff we're bombarded with, that, yeah, they voted for Biden, or they voted, they still hold a lot of these different ideas, different policies that ultimately do go against Christianity, do violate that wall being up. But I think for so many, the reason why the politicians want the open border, it's just that all walls have to come down so all things can be permitted. And so that is ultimately the spiritual battle that's at hand, is, can we keep it? Are we allowed to have walls up? Because by having a wall up, again, even symbolically what Donald Trump and the wall represented, are we allowed in the modern world to even have walls? And that wall doesn't have to be physical. It can be a theological dogma. It can be our own religion. Are we allowed to have walls? And you can see the answer is no. The answer is no. You're not allowed to have walls. You're not allowed to be sheltered by wisdom. You're not allowed to be sheltered by tradition.
Yeah, you can't say, this is what I think. You might disagree, but this is what I think. Like, even just saying that is almost risky. The other person might think, well, why wouldn't I disagree? Well, do you hold some opinion you're not allowed to have? So it quickly becomes this, in some ways, I teach for a living, right? I teach people. I'm a presenter. I teach employees, and there's often times where, and obviously I don't live in America, so I don't think things are as tense necessarily. Of course, I'm speaking out of ignorance because I don't live in the States.
Right.
But I'll often say, you might disagree with me, but we're all trying to find the truth. So if you disagree with me, tell me why I'm wrong. And if you've got good reasons, if I'm searching the truth, I'm not gonna just completely ignore you. I'm gonna listen because you clearly know something that I don't. But you can't even have that conversation. You can't even have the conversation of, well, okay, I think you're wrong here because of X, Y, and Z. You don't get to have that conversation if it's wrong just to deviate from what people feel is their dogma. Right, so it's almost like competing dogmas at the moment, right? It's competing. It's always been competing worldviews, but it is in a lot of ways a religious a religious war. We tend to think of it's almost like, and I even see this in myself. I tend to think of it as like, yes, there's the religious people, and then there's sort of secularism and this very vicious atheistic secularism that's trying to undermine tradition. But I think in some ways it's a religious war, and it's just another set of gods that they worship.
Right.
And our gods have gone to war. Now we shouldn't fear, because our God, being a God of mercy, is also a God of battles. Anybody that reads the Bible, that's actually another Chesterton quote, I think. I don't fear battles because my God is a God of battles. Patrick, if I may, just read another quote here. Do you want to finish your point?
Well, my point, I was going to say something regarding. You had so much there. I started to have a sort of whirlwind of thought.
Go for it.
But when you were, well, go ahead. Actually, I don't want to. Go ahead.
Okay, sure. We can always come back to it.
Yeah. Yep. Go to the next quote.
Okay, cool. Well, something really interesting, right, about Chesterton, since we're talking about like paradoxes and this chapter 6, the paradoxes of Christianity, he starts with an idea that I had to read it like 6 times before I really kind of understood it. Because Chesterton, when you read him, I've often said this, it's like champagne. The ideas just bubble off the page. Like as you're still trying to process an idea you read 3 sentences ago, and then he's just bombarding you with more great ideas. And the first time I read the book, I tried to highlight everything that I found was important, and I ended up just highlighting pretty much the whole book because everything is just so great. But at the beginning of this chapter, he says, the real trouble with this world of ours is not that it is an unreasonable world, nor even that it is a reasonable one. The commonest kind of trouble is that it is nearly reasonable, but not quite. Okay, then he gives some examples of this. He says, the world looks just a little bit mathematical and regular than it actually is. So he says, imagine some alien came from outer space, and it was like a mathematical alien, and it started observing humans, right? And it saw a human being, and it saw that a man is 2 men. He, on the right, exactly resembles himself on the left. Having noted that there was an arm on the right and one on the left, a leg on the right and one on the left, he might go further and still find on each side the same number of fingers, the same number of toes, 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, even twin lobes of the brain. At last, he would take it as a law that, we have this sort of dualistic. And then all these sort of twin elements to our bodies. At last, he would take it as a law, and then where he found a heart on one side, would deduce that there was another heart on the other. And just then, when he felt he was most right, he would be wrong. And then he says, it is this silent swerving from accuracy by an inch that is the uncanny element in everything in this universe. It seems like a secret treason in the universe, where you think things should be one way, but then there's this slight odd change. Okay, then he says an apple or an orange is round enough to get itself called round, but it actually isn't round. We call a blade of grass because it resembles the blade of a sword, which has a point, but grass doesn't actually have a point. Normally it sort of withers away. It doesn't have a point like a sword. If our mathematician saw from the moon, so this alien that came down, saw the 2 arms and the 2 ears, he might deduce the 2 shoulder blades and the 2 halves of the brain. But if he guessed that a man's heart was in the right place, just one on the side, I'd call him something more than a mathematician. Because at that point, not merely, so then he sort of goes on, he says, well, once you consider that things are like this, things seem like they're reasonable, but then there's this strange treason in the universe where things just don't seem to match. He then says, this is actually what Christianity is saying. And listen to this. He says, not merely that Christianity deduces logical truths, but that when it suddenly becomes illogical, Christianity, it has found, so to speak, an illogical truth. Okay, then he says, it not only goes right about things, but it goes wrong, if one may say so, exactly where the things go wrong. its plan suits the secret irregularities, and Christianity expects the unexpected. It is simple about the simple truth, but it is stubborn about the subtle truth. And I'll just end with this. Whenever we feel there is something odd in Christian theology, we shall generally find that there is something odd in the truth. So okay, so we could talk about this for a long time,
Right.
But he says, so what I got from that, right, is that it does seem to be that the universe is kind of paradoxical. There's like things that seem like they should be one way, but they're not. And Christianity aligns itself over that. It finds it acknowledges the irregularities of things. You see the world and you see happiness and you see joy, but then you find sin. And you find this strange thing that's wrong with everything, and you find love and commitment, but then you find lust, and you find these strange problems. So it's like things seem like they should be one way, but then they're not. And Christianity says, well, this is the way things are. But the modern world, in rejecting Christianity, goes, no, we have to fix it. We have to remove all of these problems, right? And they might not be thinking about it in terms of lust or sin, but they're trying to create heaven on earth. They're trying to create this utopia. And Christianity is kind of saying the uncanny nature of things, to seem like they should be one way, but they're a slightly different way, is actually the way things just are. So you can either accept that and learn to operate within that framework, or you can deny the whole framework itself. And so true progressiveness means we are progressing towards the ideal, which would be heaven on earth, right, by the Christian sense. That's true progressiveness. We're progressing towards the ideal. But modern progressiveness means we've abandoned the ideal itself, right? So I love this next part where he just says, when one believes in a creed, one is proud of its complexity, just as scientists are proud of the complexity of science. The creed shows how rich it is in its discoveries, and if it is right at all, it is a compliment to say that it is elaborately right. It's right about the smallest, most minute details, which is the shocking thing about it. A stick might fit a hole or a stone a hollow by accident, but a key and a lock are both complex. And if a key fits a lock, you know it's the right key. And Christianity is that key that fits things so uncannily well that you have billions of arrows pointing in one direction. And as I've said before, you get to a point where it takes more faith to think that the arrows mean nothing than to think that they're pointing you to Christ.
No, that I want to pick up right there, because that is so true. This idea of Christianity in these paradoxes that we're trying to highlight today, or that we've highlighted before in previous streams of Orthodox theology, the sort of mystical dimension of the theology, and how Christianity maps, it provides us a theological map that maps onto the sort of paradoxical nature of physical reality, which only makes sense if our theology is the true revelation of the Creator. Because then we have a message, we have a tradition that's actually consistent then with creation itself. And so these paradoxes, this idea of Christianity as a key that's fitting a lock, I think is so true for so many of us, like you and myself. Again, we dabbled into the psychedelic realm and many of these alternative worlds of thought, and yet somehow we come out of this to the bewilderment of many of the people that we know and say, no, now I'm a Christian, and no, I actually take it really traditionally pretty seriously. No, I don't do those activities anymore, or trying to do things in a different way. And it doesn't make any sense. And that this idea that Christianity fits the world like a key, we can do apologetics. I can talk about the tag argument and make all these logical arguments for why Christianity is true, but that's not going to convince the majority of people. What's going to convince the majority of people that Christianity is true is their lived experience of the world, somehow encountering then Christian theology or the Christian tradition, and it answering and providing insights into all these synchronistic, these providential, these very personal and specific instances that only you know about. And that somehow these synchronicities then are answered by Christianity. And so then you go down this journey, you go down this rabbit hole, and you become more and more devout in your faith. It makes no sense to the other people around you, but this idea of the paradox being solved, of the key fitting the lock, that to be true. You just can't
Yeah.
articulate that to other people because they haven't lived your life and they don't know the things to connect the dots that you've connected.
Yeah. It's like anything that you're completely convinced by. This is, I think, another Chesterton line. But anything you're completely convinced by is very hard to justify. It's very hard to explain to other people why. So if you believe in like one element, you can kind of give people arguments for that. But if somebody were to say to you, "Do you prefer civilization to, I don't know, savagery, or like living in the wild?" It's like, well. Yeah. Okay. Prove it. It's like, well, there's just so much. It's given us everything. It's like, well, I can say, well, in civilization I have this property. Well, not necessarily, but I have this house. I have this. I have somebody that's going to come and pick up the rubbish, and there's just so much to explain that anything that you're completely convinced by actually becomes more difficult to explain to other people, because there's just so many elements, right? Where do you begin? And a lot of the time, for me, when people ask me, but how did you get to that point? I kind of, at this point, just say to them, we can't have this conversation right now because it's so big. Like, there's so many things I have to explain to you. I could give you a quick, like, rushed reason, but you're just going to, it's not going to convince you. So if you're looking for convincing, ultimately, I think that I can give you my experiences and you might hear them, but I do think you need to experience it yourself on some level. At least that's what it was like for me. I mean, I had heard all the arguments, right? I'd watched all the debates. I'd heard all the Christian arguments, but it just doesn't pierce you. But then when you, I think, encounter evil in the world, or you encounter real suffering, and for me, it was the realization that my New Age worldviews, my sort of Alan Wattsian approach to life, that ultimately we are that the universe, we are God, we're experiencing ourselves, life is a game, that completely just melted away when I had to face real suffering and I had to comfort a person. And I realized that if I just told this person, actually you're suffering, let's have a long discussion about it. Your suffering is not really real. You're actually God. And, it's like, I realized how ridiculous it sounded. I realized that I would be a monster if I degraded this person's suffering down to the level of a game that they were just playing on themselves. And I'm not trying to straw man the New Age position. We don't necessarily have the time to go into all those details, but when you really get into the nitty gritty, you do start finding these details that seem so small, so difficult to articulate, but yet that key, which seems like the most bizarre key, somehow fits the most bizarre lock. Because reality is bizarre. The fact that we're here at all is completely incredible and bizarre and wonderful, but also strange. And to find a key that fits that, the key in some ways has to be just as strange. And this is one way that I think about the Trinity, right? The Trinity is a very strange idea, but it's in some ways it fits what we need, because reality is so strange, right?
Yeah, the Trinity is certainly one. There's a prominent sort of alternative comedian named Owen Benjamin that has been really trying to critique and criticize the Trinity as fallacious, yet he claims to be Christian. And so I was thinking about actually doing a stream potentially on trying to help Owen Benjamin understand the Trinity, because it takes a lot of, because it is tricky, right? It's an irony, it's a paradox, that if you're just using sort of critical skills, right? You don't know anything about theology, you have no idea about this deeper discussion, and you're just using critical skills, yeah, it doesn't seem to make sense. You have a basic argument like, well, if Jesus is God, then who is he talking to when he talks to the Father? And is he talking to himself in the Garden of Gethsemane? Right? All these things begin to break down. It seems irrational. It seems it makes no sense. But that's because, again, a failure to actually understand the beauty and the sophistication of it. It's like, if you don't know art, are you really going to be able to know why a Rembrandt is so important? There has to be a just sort of level of appreciation for this stuff. And I noticed um, that with the Trinity, it is a conundrum, right? And so if you don't begin with the proper presuppositions, if you don't begin with the proper understanding of what nature and essence is, or what a personhood is as a conceptual theological category, personhood, you're not going to understand that God, what essence is, what nature is. When Owen Benjamin has a child, is that child still human? Okay, yeah, it is still human. So essence and nature is being passed on between you and your child. Are you and your child the same person? No, you're not. So you can talk to your child. Okay, now we're beginning to understand the nature of the Trinity. Is that something can be begotten and something can proceed from something, and it will maintain the same essence of what it is. So if God begets God, it has to be God. If God proceeds from God, it has to be God. If human begets another human, it has to be human, because that's the way that natures and essences work. But that takes an entire understanding of philosophy and theology, so that then you can see why the Trinity is so beautiful and how it actually has to be true and how it breaks down dialectical problems, philosophically speaking. But if you don't know, it's like you shouldn't be talking about that stuff then, because you're going to mislead people. You're going to cause people to question things. And maybe, and I was thinking in another way, well, maybe it is beneficial, because by a public figure on the right side of things and the alternative currents, who promotes Christian values and homesteading and family and all these things, which I highly commend, that you can mislead people and kind of impugn some of their faith, which I think is, a real tragedy. And that the Trinity, once you actually understand the sophistication, is beautiful. It's incredible. It actually God has to be a Trinity, because once you see that, if it's not a Trinity, what's left? It's monism, it's dualism. Like, again, all those things have been tried, but if you're not aware of all that stuff, then what you think is like a high level criticism. Oh, well, is Jesus talking to? Come on, man! Like, this is low tier theological discussion, and so I think it'd be useful if like a video was then, because I never thought about it, but I think I want to do a stream presenting a real sophisticated presentation of the Trinity and why it's so beautiful and why it's so true. But anyways, it's sort of a tangent, but it was related to you talking about, yeah. So
it's a good one. It's a good tangent.
So, yeah, let me read and go on for a few more quotes. So again, we don't have to just deconstruct these things where they take a whole lot amount of time, but some of them are just so clever and they're just so short. I just want to say them so people can hear them.
Yeah.
And so once reads, and this is actually from 1906, guys. 1906, G.K. Chesterton wrote, "None of the modern machines, none of the modern paraphernalia have any power over the people who choose to use them. I'm sorry, have any power except over the people who choose to use them." Let me rephrase that. I totally messed that up. None of the modern machines, none of the modern paraphernalia have any power except over the people who choose to use them. And the reason why I chose that one is I thought it applied perfectly with the social media bans, the purging online, the corporatism that we're now faced in regard, like globalism. To attain the political globalism, it's going to be enacted through corporatism. And that's what we're seeing with the Fortune 500 companies. And the only way that, they ultimately have power over us because of the way commerce works is that we participate in it. And that's why then we look at these economic collapse and how COVID and the pandemic's been used to destroy the economies, to make people more dependent on the system, is that because the system's only power is that you're dependent on it. That's where it gets its power. And so the modern machines, the modern paraphernalia have no power except over the people who choose to use them. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind, that by me having this iPhone, I've submitted in one degree, right? So at some degree, I'm complicit in my own persecution. We have to recognize that the only way in which these things actually have no power over us is if we don't use them. And when we're not using them, what are we doing? We're not taking the world. We're not taking what man can offer us. Because if we just don't, if we refuse everything, what are we left with? We're still left with, the basic necessities, what God ultimately provides for us. And so I think this is a useful thing to keep in mind in regards to what we're facing right now. You have any specific thought on the power of...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I would just say, on some level, we kind of just have to accept that if we want to be in the battle at all, we kind of have to some degree, use the systems that are around us. But I think also it's important to realize that you can use your cell phone for evil, you can use it for good. You can use your access to technology to spread the word of God, or you can use it to hide the word of God. So it ultimately comes down to how you choose to use these things. But also just be aware and just know that you are, in some sense, you are participating in the world
Right.
in a lot of ways. So since you are already doing that, you might as well do the best you can with what you have.
Right. Another quote I wanted to share is from 1919, and it says, "This is the age in which thin and theoretic minorities can cover and conquer unconscious and untheoretic majorities." And I think that is so profound. Again, I'll repeat that for you guys. This is the age, and again, he wrote this in 1919, in which thin and theoretic minorities can cover and conquer unconscious and untheoretic majorities. And so when we look then at our present world, I think this is so accurate, because what is, we want to talk about globalism or all this stuff. These are theoretical structures of a small, thin, few amount of people. And so a few amount of people using pernicious theory can actually take over masses, the majority, through being unconscious and untheoretical, right? And so I think this is so true. This is absolutely so true. And again, I think it's the nature of reality, right? And at no point in human history, moving forward or back, I think, is the majority of people going to be quote unquote theoretic, right? Because that's just not the way the world is. But given that it is that way, this is so true that thin and then theoretic minorities, like what it's the billionaire class, this is a theoretical category, right? I mean, this isn't like as he says, an untheoretic majority. It's not a racial demographic. It's not a ethnic demographic. These aren't theories. And so the sort of elitism, these are sort of more theoretical categories that group or clump people together. And I think it's just really insightful. This is the age in which thin and theoretic minorities can cover and conquer unconscious and untheoretic majorities. Any thoughts on that one?
No, man. I think you said it all.
Okay.
Great line.
A quick one that I thought was funny, made me chuckle, is he said, G.K. Chesterton wrote, "The past is not what it was."
That's a great one. It reminds me of another one. If there were no God, there would be no atheists.
Yeah, I got that one too. That's a good one.
That's wonderful.
I thought this one was potentially interesting. This was on romance and love, and he said, "Women are the only realists. Their whole object in life is to pit their realism against the extravagant, excessive, and occasionally drunken idealism of men." That was out of one of his books, Through the Mouth of a Character he created. But I thought that was kind of interesting. Any thoughts on that, of women being the realist and bumping up against the drunken idealism of men?
I think it speaks for itself. I would honestly have to think about it a bit before I gave thoughts. But it's very interesting.
Yeah, I thought it's certainly something to reflect on. I'd like to think a little bit more about it. Because immediately I think, okay, maybe this is part of the problem. If what he's saying is accurate, just using that framework, right? This is just how I think about things. So I'll just adopt his framework for a second. If that is true, do what we see with some of the feminism, the third wave feminism, the sort of masculinization of women, is that women are taking on more and more idealistic qualities? are women themselves becoming more and more idealistic, and men are becoming more and more realistic in the sense of their intimidation of the world, their submission to the world, their there's the woman probably doesn't like me. Is this a sort of realism that is actually inverts the courageous qualities of man, being being strong, being aggressive, pursuing the world, that almost demands a sort of idealistic framework? And so when we see the inversion, the feminization of the world, is it the case that women then are the ones that are instigating and moving and directing the affairs of the world because they're the idealists now, and the men are sort of the realistic reactors to reality? I don't know. It's an interesting idea. I just came up with it. It's an interesting idea. I'd have to think more about it.
It's a very interesting idea. Yeah, it's like we've become timid and fearful, and we've almost lost the ideal. I will definitely think about that one more. Do you have another quote you'd like to read?
Yeah. So, marriage is a duel to the death, which no man of honor should decline. I like that one.
Yes, I love that one.
I have little doubt that when St. George killed the dragon, he was heartily afraid of the princess. That made me chuckle. I thought it was funny. That you hear it from married couples, that a man's more terrified of his wife than potential, monsters in the world. I think that's what that's insinuating. So I thought that was funny. The Bible tells us to love our neighbors and also to love our neighbors. Probably because, generally speaking, they're the same people.
Could you read the first part again? Sorry, I didn't.
Oh yeah,
the Bible tells us to.
The Bible tells us to love our neighbors and to love our enemies. Probably because they are generally the same people.
Oh yes, yeah, they usually are.
I know. That's why I thought that was hilarious. As you said, if there were no God, there would be no atheists. It has been often said, very truly, that religion is the thing that makes the ordinary man feel extraordinary. And it is an equally important truth that it is religion to be the thing that makes the extraordinary man feel ordinary. I love that.
Yes, love it.
That's a sort of paradoxical truth. And it is so appropriate because when you look at how, again, people's different approaches or journeys to Christianity, the person in despair, through religion, they're lifted up. So that they feel extraordinary. They're brought up, they're significant. God knows their name. God loves them. But the man who's already of high esteem, is extraordinary or egotistical, or maybe has high social status, it's going to take religion, it's going to take Christianity then to bring him down and make him more humble. And yet at the same time, the man of despair or depression and the man of great elevation and societal worth, they end up standing side by side in the same place.
Yeah. If I may just jump in there. Yeah, it's like, so we've crucified the highest of the high. We've made the highest of the high the lowest of the low. And this gives the lowest in society an elevation, right? So when you see somebody who is the lowest among us will be the highest in the kingdom of heaven. So it's like this complete, wonderful inversion where, as opposed to the ancient world, the lowest of the low are not worthless. In fact, they have a certain dignity that cannot be taken away from them. And you mentioned humility, and this is, I think, one of Chesterton's greatest quotes. When you hear it, I think it takes a second to click, but it's genius. It's so paradoxical and it's beautiful. He says, "Humility is the mother of giants. One sees great things from the valley and only small things from the peak." I'll read it again. Humility is the mother of giants. One sees great things from the valley, down at the bottom, looking up at the mountain, looking up at these incredible views. But once you're on the peak, you see only small things, right? So it's like this idea that once you're at the top, once you elevate yourself completely above everything else just looks small. But when you lower yourself, everything looks grand and everything looks much more interesting. When you realize that people on the street are not that interested in you, and you humble yourself, you can actually start living your life
Right.
because you're not constantly worrying about what other people think, right? You
Right.
could start to be interested in them because they're no longer interested in you, or at least you've realized they're not interested in you.
Right.
Could I read another one, Patrick?
Yeah, feel free. I got a bunch here too. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. This one is, I think, if not the best, one of, for me, his best ever quotes, and
Wow.
it just works so well. He says, "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried." You don't try the Christian ideal and find that it's lacking. You often find it's really difficult, and so people abandon it.
Right.
Which is so true. Supremely based.
Let me back up that quote with one of my favorite ones that I read. A little bit of different speed is, the truth is, of course, that the curtness of the Ten Commandments is an evidence, not of the gloom and narrowness of a religion, but on the contrary, of its liberality and humanity. It is shorter to state the things forbidden than the things permitted, precisely because most things are permitted. Only a few things are forbidden. And I think that is so wonderful. Again, when we talk about those walls and knowing why the walls are taken down, is those 10 commandments are a wall. That is a wall that then provides, as you said, a sort of playground or a safe space, a shield from the fallenness of the world, or at least an area in which we can move and be more honest with ourselves. So I love that it totally inverts, and that's the paradox of it, this idea that, oh, God has all these rules and all these things you have to do, on the exact opposite. He only has 10 things that he told you you can't do, and then permits all other things. Why then is it God who's the one that's limiting? It's you that's limiting by only wanting the things that you can't have.
Yeah. In chapter 4 of Orthodoxy, Ethics of Elfland, which is, I maintain, one of the greatest chapters ever written, Chesterton says that every great fairy tale has something that the main hero mustn't do. So you can go to the ball, but you must be back at this time. You can save this person, but don't touch the ground. Don't get off your horse. You can go there, but don't eat this apple. Don't prick your finger. In the same way, reality itself has complete freedom, but there's something we shouldn't do. We should thank God for beer by not drinking too much of it and, becoming alcoholics. We should thank God for the joys of life by not abusing them.
Well, that's the theology of fasting right there. So what you've just highlighted is exactly what fasting is, and so that's why you have like Meat Fair Sunday, where you eat as much meat as you want to give glory to God and show that meat is good, and that because meat is good, you're no longer going to intake meat for this certain amount of period. And so that what you just highlight is exactly the theology of why fasting then is important. Although fasting shouldn't be the goal, all right, because I think fasting, in regards, I think in some Orthodox circles, it gets tied into a sort of pietism and like you holding the fast and how good of a Christian you are, when obviously it's very commendable, but it just from things that I've listened to from multiple church fathers and priests speak about, is that we can't let fasting, a way in which we actually come closer to God, that we can actually uphold the fast and move away from God that entire period.
Yeah, you also don't want fasting to become a source of pride, where you start to think you're better than other people because you are, I'm maintaining my fast and I'm more devout than you. Look at me. I saw this great comic where it's the story of the Pharisee saying, "Thank God I'm nothing like that that man who comes begging, and then the guy who's reading the Bible goes, "Wow, this Pharisee is so judgmental. Thank God I'm nothing like him." And then the guy reading the Bible goes, "Oh no, I'm doing the same thing," right? And
That's hilarious.
it's I mean, yeah. What can I say?
We got a few more quotes I want to share. These are the days when the Christian is expected to praise every creed except his own. And
I love that quote.
Isn't that the truth? These are the days when the Christian is expected to praise every creed except his own. And that, again, I think makes total sense because those creeds are true. And the world is about inversion. The world is about deviating from that one true narrow path that it be. Anything you want to say, or just move on to the? I just have a few more on my end, and then I can be done with my list. We can read your list. We could read some other ones, or we can hop off. We're already basically about an hour and a half in. We have a few super chats, so people may have some questions for us. But alone of all creed. Oh no, I keep reading. That's the second time I went over that one. A queer and almost mad notion seems to have got into the modern head that if you mix up everybody and everything, more or less anyhow, the mixture may be called unity, and the unity may be called peace. It is supposed that if you break down all doors and walls so that there is no domesticity, there will be then nothing but friendship. Surely somebody must have noticed by this time that the men living in a hotel quarrel at least as often as the men living in a street. And I thought this really highlights, again, the notion of multiculturalism, presupposition of globalism, this idea that friendship and unity is just a sort of variegated group of individuals coexisting together. When unity as a concept is way deeper than that. And so just by locality doesn't unify people. And so people can live right next to each other and not be unified. Unity is a deeper notion that I think would get back into beliefs, values, culture, that I can be more unified to a man of a totally opposite ethnicity than me, than somebody of the same ethnicity. Now, certainly ethnicity is another way in which people can be unified. But the idea of multiculturalism negates the physical unity of racial and ethnic identity and diversity, and that being a sort of unifying characteristic. And it also negates the importance of the underlying values and structures. And so unity then is just this idea that you just put diverse people next to each other and you call that unity. And that's, I think, we kind of live in that world now.
Yeah, it's like unity becomes a question of geography. Where are you physically located? And if I put enough people in this place, it's going to somehow equal unity. But it's much more complicated than that, right? Because unity is tricky to get right. I mean, people for most of human history have struggled to establish some form of unity. It's not something, it's a problem, it's a serious problem. And I think in some ways, just thinking that if we put people together and just sort of give them, I mean, you also have to have some sort of principle which you can all orient yourselves around, right? So for most of the time, that might be the country, or sort of a love of country or patriotism,
right?
And then it might also be religious, right? A love of Christ. But if
both of which I want to quickly highlight, both of which are directly being attacked by the globalists. So we see now the FBI and the U.S. federal government under the Biden administration attacking people of nationalistic pride, patriots or whatnot, now being deemed domestic terrorists. So you're talking about, well, a couple sources of unity: nationalism, Christ, both of which are now front and center under persecution. People who are nationalists and people who are Christians. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, it's very interesting for me as a foreigner to observe the way things are playing out in the States. I can walk down the street with a South African flag and tell people I love my country. People will agree with me. It's I don't know if you could do that. I mean, I guess it depends on what area you're in. I don't want to speak out of ignorance now, um, but yeah, you need some sort of organizing principle, right? Either Christ or a love of country. And I think that if the organizing principle is something flimsy, then the unity is going to be flimsy. And if the
Right.
organizing principle is just a concept somebody made up, it's just a term, then the unity is not going to be real. It's going to be a forced unity,
Right.
and people are ultimately going to end up disunified. People are going to end up probably, thinking, well, I have nothing in common with you. I'm just going to avoid you. And I think what you'll find is people naturally will start trying to organize themselves with people they get along with and people that they understand and people that they can relate to. And the guy who loves McDonald's doesn't want to hang out with the people that are constantly saying McDonald's is awful. And that's a weird example, but
Right.
people will naturally organize themselves around things that they feel are unifying principles. And the greatest would be Christ, and then the next one would probably be a love of country. And of
Right.
course, you should love your country. I mean, your country. I mean, you can never really. Okay, so if you think about the personal level, your parents have given you something that you can never give back to them, right? Your parents have given you, your parents have given you a home, and they've given you everything. Nurtured you. They looked after you as a child. But then you can go a step further and think, well, your country's given you a lot of things that you'll never be able to give back to your country. Hopefully, if you're living in a safe country, they've given you safety. But then if you go even further, you go higher up, you'll realize eventually you get to God, and God has given you everything, and you can never repay God for what he's done for you. So it's almost like you have these levels of respect for family, then respect for country, then respect for God. But it seems to me a very strange idea to say that you shouldn't even have those levels of appreciation for things that you've been given. I think Paul says in somewhere in Corinthians that what do you own that wasn't given to you? And I mean, and you can say, oh, well, I worked for it and I earned the money and I went and bought it. Yes, but you're not getting the point. Think deeper.
Right. Exactly. The
Why are we even
opportunity.
in a position?
Yeah. The opportunity itself is given.
Exactly. So, anyway, that was a bit of a tangent. We should start a podcast, by the way. We should call it The Tangent, where we just talk about tangents for hours.
Anyway. It would go on for a while for sure. I just have two more quotes I was going to read, and I'm done with my list. And so
Sure.
the two that I have that I haven't read, one that both of them actually, one relates to friendship. And so he wrote this in The Apostle of the Wild Ducks, and it reads, "For friendship implies individuality, whereas comradeship really implies the temporary subordination, if not the temporary swamping of individuality. Friends are better for being two, but comrades are better for being 2,000,000. And the reason why I chose that quote is because, again, of what we're up against. And there's two things that I wanted to highlight. One is obviously our theology of Orthodox Christianity, beginning with personhood. So friendship is better being two. Friendship implies 1-to-1. And when he uses the term comradeship, because he's actually referring back to the communists, this is early 20th century, and we can see the exact same thing happening in this country, right? First night of the Biden administration is Antifa goes and destroys the Seattle police station or something like that. And the website antifa.com takes you right back to the whitehouse.gov website. Literally the first day Biden's as president, the Antifa website takes you to the White House now. So what we see then is, I think, a perfect framework for a different perception of the relationships. So we as Christians in this sort of alternative community, we're trying to build these one-to-one relationships, real friendships, where is it really a friendship amongst all the communists, all the Antifa that may be destroying that place? Their comradeship is only binds them together only in the sense of their submission to the ideal, to the goal, to the ultimate authority. And that isn't friendship. And so when we look then at America or at the world, we see a lot of comrades. We see much less actual friends. And I thought that's just a really interesting idea, and I think it creates a great framework to look at things that are happening again right now in 2021.
Yeah, what a time to be alive, eh? Thinking about it, it's bizarre. Patrick, I really only have, I think, 4 quotes, and they're very short.
Yeah,
And to the
I
point.
have one more. So my last one
One
is,
more.
the man of the true religious tradition understands two things: liberty and obedience. The first means knowing what you really want, and the second means knowing what you really trust. And so I love that. For the true religious man, there's only liberty and obedience. And so those two things seem contradictory, seem like a paradox, seem like an irony. We've talked about the self-discipline, the self-control, leading to freedom, eternal freedom, everlasting life. And so within this quote, it's highlighting the same thing. And I love the second part, that the first, liberty, means knowing what you really want. And the second, obedience, means knowing what you really trust. And so are we obedient to God, or are we obedient to the world? Questions we have to really ask ourselves. And again, what he's saying is true for the true religious man. So that's the last quote I had. Feel free to read your list.
Yeah, that's a great quote, and I love that idea that we're obedient because we trust God. That's beautiful. And okay, so one that I found that I thought was quite interesting, because I think it really appeals to people that come from a New Age background like you and I. Um, Chesterton says, when men stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. Which is so true. I mean, you'll believe anything because you don't believe in God. It's funny, you think, I'm no longer believing any crazy stories, but as a consequence of abandoning God and the metaphysical structure you get from that, pretty much anything might find its way into that space. It might be mushrooms, it might be Terence McKenna, right. It might be Alan Watts, it might be, anything. And it might be so bizarre, but for some reason, someone can give you the most bizarre idea, right? People can tell you about how they traveled to the Pleiades and danced with Mother Ayahuasca, right. And that seems to make sense when you're immersed in that worldview. But it's exactly what he's saying. When men stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing; they believe in anything. And this feeds on to the next quote I have, which is...
I want to make a comment. I want to make a comment.
Go for it. Go for it.
So read that quote one more time.
Sure. It says, when men stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing. They believe in anything.
And so I thought, when you first read it, the first thing that popped in my mind was, by removing God, you're removing the basis for thinking as an enterprise in general. Because once you remove God, you remove the objectivity and the purpose of thinking. And so no wonder then you would fall for anything, because the orientation of thinking is to move towards truth. Again, it presumes all these presuppositions that are actually embedded within a paradigm that assumes God first and foremost. And so once you remove God, the point of thinking, for them, again, our framework, that makes a lot of sense. If you said that to an atheist, well, that doesn't make any sense. Because they can still think and do science, take measurement and averages and all this stuff, which is true, but ultimately their own worldview ends up falling short. It undercuts itself. There's contradictions. There's obvious limitations, and so I thought that was apropos, that quote, that it's when we remove God, you remove the basis for the orienting force for thinking in general. No wonder you'll fall victim to anything.
Yes, the orienting force of thinking. You dislodge the logos, right?
Right.
You dislodge it. You remove it. So it's like it's like trying to build a building, but you don't have. You've completely gotten rid of measurements. You've got no sense of. You've got no rulers. You've got no measuring tape. You've got nothing.
Exactly,
you just kind of. Right.
That's it. That is a great analogy. It's like building something without all the tools used to construct and measure. Right, because that is what the Logos does. Reason, logic, love, honor, glory, language. This is how we, interact with the world in different ways. So, yeah.
Yeah, and then you're kind of just spitballing everything. You're kind of just sort of going on feeling because you don't have logic or reason to guide you. Okay, so then that quote, right, that when men stop believing in God, they believe in anything, that kind of sort of fits into this other quote, which is, once you abolish God, you make the government the God.
Yep.
This usually happens, right? Because people will look for something to solve their problems. If we can just get this person into power, all my problems will be solved. If I can just get the guy who shares this view with me into power, then everything will be great. So you see people, I think most people live mythological lives in the sense that, you see people wearing symbols of what they want to represent. You see people embedded within a mythological framework, even though they don't know it. And they'll start spreading ideas through their clothing. They'll start wearing, political clothing. In a way, they're kind of worshiping something. They're trying to promote something, because worship is worthship. What is worth our praise, right? So they put worth on that thing. They elevate it as an ideal, and then they pursue it because they think that will solve all of their problems. But if that's not God, it becomes a vacuum, and you'll fill it with anything else. And oftentimes, for a lot of people who are desperate, the only thing that they can fill that with is government.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, I think, do it with science, where they end up worshiping science. They walk into their room and they bow in front of a picture of Carl Sagan, and they just have this kind of, they worship something. Some people don't do that. Some people worship bands. Their whole identity is the bands they listen to, and there's nothing wrong with listening to bands. There's nothing wrong with science in itself. But once you worship that thing, you've essentially turned it into an idol, right? And at that point, it's just what he's saying. It's once you abolish God, the government becomes the God, and if not the government, something. You will fill that void in some way.
Right. And so another way to frame that is just asking what people ultimately appeal to as authoritative. And so to use that same framework, you're saying that once they remove God, the government becomes their God. That is true for a vast majority of people who claim to be religious. And again, that's what I was trying to highlight earlier with this whole mass stuff, is what is authoritative in your worldview. I don't care what you say. What is ultimately authoritative? And it is the government. For so many people who say that they actually worship God, the ultimate authority in their life is the government. And so when the government tells them to do something, they do it, and they don't think twice about it. It's just, to me, it's so sad. And so we have to keep God first and foremost in our lives so we don't fall victim to these authoritative appeals of the world. And we do it, all of us do it at a very unconscious level, I think. And that's what part of articulating these things and talking about theology over and over, it strengthens the mind, it sharpens the mind to a degree where it doesn't fall victim to these things as easily. And so you begin to slowly over time, your mind, by talking about these things, can cleave itself from the world a little bit better, and you can perceive things a little bit better. And so we just have to be careful that we ourselves, even though we claim to be Orthodox or we claim to worship God, that at different points in our life, we actually don't appeal back to the authority of the world over that of God.
Yeah, that is I think the eternal temptation, right? To basically, because essentially we decide that we are going to define what is good, what is right, what I'm going to pursue. And if you pursue anything other than God, ultimately, if you go by the Bible, eventually it's going to lead you to ruin, one way or another, in the long run, and sometimes in the short run. Okay, so there's another quote here that I think is, this one's wonderful. It's so short. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 6 words, but it's so deep. It's almost at the bottom. Okay, it says, evil always takes advantage of ambiguity. Evil always takes advantage of ambiguity. Yep. Things that are not clear, things that are not defined, right? Words are... it's what we mentioned earlier about like the redefinition of words. It's where you think the words you're using, you don't even really know anymore if the other person is hearing what you mean when you use those words, because there's so much ambiguity.
Right.
on definitions. So evil always takes advantage of that. Should I eat the fruit? I'm not really sure. It's ambiguous. You're not sure, and that's where evil can come in. And I think in our own personal lives, the areas where we are unsure, perhaps about a church teaching or a doctrinal issue, those areas of ambiguity are areas where we can be targeted and we can fall short. So we want to be careful, because evil loves ambiguity. Evil loves to use ambiguity in a targeted way. So you've got to be careful. Areas where you're ignorant, it might be something where someone's taking advantage of you and you just don't even realize it,
Right.
because the issue itself is so ambiguous and you yourself might be so ignorant about it.
Right.
And then
because I've said that same thing over and over regards to ambiguity, and how I've highlighted before with Alexander Schmemann in one of his books. Again, this emphasis on person is very unambiguous. That when you encounter a person, when you are a person, it's pretty definite, you know it. And so when I interact with you, I'm interacting with another person. And so the ambiguity then of interacting in regards to the world, in regards to I love the world, I love humanity, I love all these ambiguous concepts, is it always allows evil to creep in. And so then look at the progressive, their mantras. All of them are taking an inverted form of a Christian virtue and then applying it to this great ambiguous concept, which is ultimately moving people and funneling people towards an evil agenda. And so we're seeing it in real time right now in the world. And so when people are so worried about social justice, and so they're using the Christian virtue of humility and justice and care for the less fortunate, and that rhetoric envelops them, and then they get but what is social justice? I mean, does justice need a modifier? I thought justice is justice no matter where it occurs. So we're doing the game. I'm trying to show people, I feel like every stream I'm a broken record, is that it's a linguistic game. The redefining of what justice means is now when you say your mind moves into the sort of alleyway in which their whole world moves.
And I'm reminded of the phrase "love is love." It's so ambiguous.
Right. What does that mean? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's okay, but so there's going to be some kinds of love that are not right? I mean, if I really love animals, there's got to be a line there. There's got to be something I'm not willing to do, right? I don't want to go into that right now, but anytime you encounter ambiguity, your first reaction should be to try and clarify terms. Okay, but what do you mean by this? Can you give me an example? And if the person doesn't want to give an example, it's likely because they can only thrive within the ambiguous framework, because they themselves haven't clarified their thoughts. Yeah. Okay, I've got one more. This one is kind of, I like it. This one's witty. It's a great quote, like all the rest. Chesterton says, "Without education, we are in a horrible and deadly danger of taking educated people seriously." I'll read it again. Without education, we are in a horrible and deadly danger of taking educated people seriously. And right. I love this thought that if you are, so it's an uneducated person is just uneducated, but a person who's been badly educated is actually more dangerous, because someone that's been badly educated will operate in the world with false presuppositions, and they'll do things in the world which will actually make things worse. Mm-hmm. Whereas if someone is just uneducated, an uneducated person is leagues better than somebody who has an education, but their education has just been completely botched, and their whole view of the world is completely skewed. You'd rather be uneducated, because at least your guiding principle is something like common sense, whereas the miseducated person has sort of lost their sixth sense, the common sense, right?
Right.
Yeah. That's also a humbling quote, right? Because if you are educated, it kind of reminds you, like, yeah, there's a lot I don't know.
Oh, yeah,
And
it definitely reminds you of one's own ignorance. But to me,
yeah,
as somebody had going and trying to finish up a PhD and therefore going through the academy, going through the prestigious institution of education, is that the more I proceeded, the more I progressed, the more I actually um, didn't want to be a part of that. The more I see the sort of frailties of academics and intellectuals as certainly people that you would take and form a worldview or a paradigm around, because they themselves, it's just quirky people. Intelligence. It's an interesting topic, intelligence, because is it overvalued? Is it underappreciated? Because I think both are true. How can that? That doesn't seem to make sense, but I think it actually is that real critical thinking and logical thought is undervalued. Most people actually can't do it. They can't engage with it. But perceived intelligence, PhDs, credentials, numbers, and letters behind names, it's so overvalued and inflated. And these people, they aren't arbiters of truth. You know, they may know a lot about, especially the specialization in the academy doesn't necessarily produce a quality individual, right? It's not like this renaissance or an older ideal of education, that what education does is fulfill man and allows him to be the fullest expression of himself. Education now is a form to manipulate, to mislead, to control. That if you don't agree with me, then you're wrong. I mean, think about the diversity of opinion in the university. There isn't any, and so and then I mean, what a society would appeal more to the intellectual than a communist society? I mean, it's like that's what they do, right? They appeal to this airy-fairy theoretical world because the theory of the world itself in a communist structure is theoretical. Whenever it's played out in a practical level, it always fails. And so if it's always theoretical, who are the people that are going to be the most prominent spokesperson for that other than theorists, other than intellectuals and academics who put this whole thing together, theoretically speaking? And so they're always the sort of driving force behind this. And so I think then it connects with the archetype of the evil genius, because intelligence is such an easy way to fall in love with oneself.
yeah, and that pride that comes from that perceived intelligence. If you don't get a hold of it and you don't admit that you don't really know that much, it can just escalate. And the burglar, he takes your property and steals it. So he still believes in property. He just believes that it should be his property.
Right.
But the communist believes that property itself should be removed. So in some sense, it's more evil, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. You had another quote?
Oh, let me quickly check here.
I thought you had.
No. That was the last one.
Okay.
That was the last one.
Well, geez, that almost takes us to 2 hours. So we can hit these super chats real quick. If you guys have any more questions or anything you guys would like to say, feel free to do that now. First super chat was sent in by Ephraim. He threw a 1999. Thank you very much, brother. I appreciate it. Good ortho, bro. Always here in the streams. And said, hoping you may be familiar with distributism as an economic third way, partly developed by G.K. Chesterton. If so, how may we better introduce these values into orthodoxy if they are compatible? Do you want to start with the distributism question?
Yeah, I'll just say I'm going to have to be honest here, and distributism is one of my blind spots. I have not done much reading on it. I know that Chesterton has explored it, and Chesterton is in many ways a great promoter of it, but I'm too ignorant to have an opinion, unfortunately. Sorry, Ephraim, but I so appreciate it's great that you're supporting the Church of the Eternal Logos. But sorry, man, I don't have much to say. I would just be making things up.
Yeah, I myself am in a similar boat. I've heard sort of lip service to distributism from people who support it, and um, I would be interested in a much fuller explication of distributism in its relationship to socialism and then communism as different ideology. I'm just not as familiar with it, and I feel bad, brother, because you threw in 1999, and I don't really have a whole lot of substance to back up the question you have. I know, as Dylan said, I'm familiar that GK, he put a lot of these ideas forward and popularized distributism. I know that within Orthodox circles, there's a lot of sympathetic people within a sort of monarchical government framework that they think that distributism may be an option. I personally need to read more about it. I just don't want to voice an opinion that after a few hours of research I wish I had taken back in front of people publicly. So
Yeah.
I'm just not sure. I would need to look into distributism and see where maybe it does butt up against Orthodox theology or is consistent with it. I'm just not as familiar. I'm sorry, brother. So the next one is 499 throws in from Mama Llama. Great Orthodox sister, former psychonaut as well. She actually was a follower of mine back at Fractal Universe. So Mama Llama, her and her family are now on the Orthodox train. So
Wow. Awesome.
yeah, and so she says existential glory to God. So I guess she was really enjoying some of the wisdom you were sharing earlier. So thank you very much, Mama Llama. Thank you, Anna. Truly appreciate the support. I'm sure Dylan does as well. And God bless you and the family. Hope everybody is doing well as always.
Yeah, thank you.
Joe Wags throws in $10 and says, "Love your streams, brother. God bless." And I say, thank you so much, Joe Wags. I appreciate that, brother. Thank you very much for your support. I truly appreciate it. $10 means a lot, actually. And so thank you very much, Joe, for being here. The last super chat, I am not sure how I pronounce your name. Naya Mutography, I think is what it is. And Naya Mutography throws in £5. So he's over in the UK. Thank you very much, brother. No comment. So thank you so much, Niamatography. I'm glad you must appreciated some of the things that were shared here this evening. So that seems like that's about all the super chats. I don't see any more questions really. So Dylan, I will put your link and everything in this video description. I don't have it in there right now. I need to do that. I'll do that right when we hop off here. You want to talk to the people about the best ways in which they can reach you, find you, some things that you're working on, what to expect in the future, that type of stuff?
Yeah, sure. So I run a YouTube channel called Existential Delight, which you can find in the links. Patrick will put them down below. That's really my hub. It's one of my hobbies. I work a full-time job, but on the side, it's like a hobby I have. I create videos exploring a lot of different topics. I have philosophy. I've got music analysis, film analysis. I look for Christian themes in a lot of movies and music, even Tool, Tool music. So I try and extract where I can. And I have weird combinations of things. So I do this thing called synth wave, or not synthwave, sorry, Numa mix, which is basically where I take complicated philosophical lectures and I mix them to synth music. So there's a lot of stuff. There's stuff for everybody on the channel. But if you want to support the channel, a subscription really helps. There is merchandise, there's all the rest, but just a subscription and watching a video, leaving a like, that really, really helps. In terms of the future, 2021 has been interesting so far. I've just released 2 videos recently, and more videos are in the works. A lot more music analysis, film analysis, and of course Christianity and the truth.
Absolutely. How is your I watched your video, the Harry Potter video, when it first came out. How is it doing now? People generally like it, the reaction?
Yeah, the reaction's been great. I just released one where, okay, so I don't know if you know, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien had a really famous walk at Oxford where Tolkien was explaining myth and reality to C.S. Lewis. And that conversation was actually one of the conversations that led C.S. Lewis down to belief in Christianity. So I found a dramatic recreation of that conversation that they have between Tolkien and Lewis, and I mixed it to music. And I did like this video where you can see both of them, and I've added subtitles so it looks like they're talking. That video is really cool, and that's doing really well. The feedback's been really great. Voldemort's doing great, and the channel is growing, which I'm really grateful about. So it's really can't complain. Oh, I did forget to say, if you want to follow me on Instagram, I am also there. That's at Existential Deli. I don't use Twitter anymore, just for sanity reasons, and I am slowly moving on to more platforms. But I'm constantly updating people on my community tab on the channel. But YouTube is the main way to find my content.
Okay, and I am sharing your Instagram right now, so people can go follow you there. If you guys just look in the video description now, his links to his YouTube and his Instagram should be there. So definitely go subscribe and follow on those guys. So they are now in the video description. I'm sharing them also in the chat. So here is his Instagram, and here is his YouTube. So for everybody in the chat that's still here, you can just click on those and go over there. So thank you very much, brother, for coming on. I think this is a very insightful conversation that a lot of people, I think, are going to enjoy. A lot of different angles. That was the whole point, is to scratch that itch, as you properly said, that is difficult to scratch in regards to appealing the Christian tradition to non-believers and to believers, strengthening people's faiths. And so I think today may have done that for some people. I really look forward to see some of the reactions in the comment section. If you guys are interested, as always, I just shared a link to the website to become a website member. Dylan and I are going to hop off here, and we are going to then discuss and share a few ideas on his most recent video on Harry Potter and evil. And so if that is something you guys would like to watch, as well as a previous conversation we had, that's up at the website with tons of other videos. And so become a website member. I would greatly appreciate that. But yeah, that basically concludes today's video. Thank you everybody who threw in a super chat. Thank you everybody who is here in the chat. I know that a lot of ortho bros are making content right now. I know Jay Dyer's live right now. Yeah, I know he pulled a few of the viewers away from here, but that's expected. So everyone have a wonderful weekend, TGIF, and I will see you when I see you. I have multiple ideas on some new streams. I don't know if I'm going to stream tomorrow, Sunday, Monday. I may stream tonight. I don't know. So I will see you guys. Have a wonderful weekend, and as always, until next time, God bless.
Yeah, God bless.